The last text message I ever sent to my wife was a lie. I told her I loved her, which was true, and that I was just finishing up and would be home soon, which was a fabrication designed to make her stop worrying and go to sleep. It was 1:17 a.m. The old farmhouse was silent, except for the persistent, rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet in the kitchenette of the basement office I'd converted into a workspace. I was a freelance editor, and a client's emergency rewrite had bled into the small hours. Asterisk, the house itself was a rental, a temporary solution after our apartment building had been sold. It sat on 5 acres of overgrown pasture, at the end a gravel road, a place so isolated that the silence felt like a physical weight. My wife, Alina, hated it. She swore she heard footsteps in the attic at night, saw shadows moving in the peripheral blur of her vision. I, the pragmatist, attributed it to an old house settling and an overactive imagination fueled by too many true crime podcasts. That night, I was grateful for the solitude to work without her gentle sighs of displeasure drifting down from the bedroom. Asterisk. My concentration was broken by a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the faucet, it was a scrape. A long, slow, deliberate scrape from directly above my head. It started near the far wall of the room above the living room and traveled across the ceiling towards the staircase. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged, something like a body. Asterisk. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My first rational thought was that a branch was scratching against the roof, but the sound was too rhythmic, too weighted. It stopped directly above the stairwell. I stared at the ceiling, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I waited, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Asterisk. Just the house, I whispered to myself. The words feeling thin and useless in the vast, dark space. Asterisk. I tried to refocus on the manuscript on my screen, but the words were just meaningless symbols. My mind was now a radar, sweeping the darkness for any anomaly. The basement door was at the top of a short flight of stairs behind me, and it was open a crack. As I'd left it to let some of the warmth from the upper floors drift down, a sliver of absolute blackness marked its edge. Asterisk. Then came the footsteps. Asterisk. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They started in the living room, right where the scraping had stopped. A floorboard creaked, a sound I knew well. Then another, closer to the top of the main stairs that led to the second floor. Not the basement stairs, the main stairs. They were heading up to Alina. Asterisk. The thought of her sleeping, unaware, sent a jolt of pure animal terror through me. I shot up from my chair, knocking it over. I had to get to her. I grabbed the only thing within reach, a heavy, glass paperweight, shaped like a globan, charged for the basement steps. I took them 2 at a time, my hand slamming against the door and throwing it open into the dark kitchen. Asterisk. The house was a furnace of dread. The air was thick and cold. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic scuff of my socks on the linoleum. I cut through the dining room, my path lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. As I reached the foot of the main staircase, I heard it again, a footstep, not above me this time. It was on the stairs, right in front of me. Asterisk. I stopped dead, my eyes strained into the darkness of the stairwell. I saw nothing, but I felt a displacement of air, a subtle pressure change, as if a large mass had just passed by me in the confined space. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. It was on the stairs with me, and it had just gone down. Asterisk, I was no longer trying to get to Alina. I was trying to get us both out. I flew up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. My only thought to get to our bedroom, lock the door, and call 911. I reached the landing and ran for the bedroom door. It was open. I'd closed it before I went down to work. I was sure of it. Asterisk, I burst inside, fumbling for the light switch. The overhead light blazed on, revealing the room. It was empty. The bed was made. The covers were untouched. Alina wasn't there. Asterisk, a cold dread, colder than any fear I'd ever known, seeped into my bones. I called her name, my voice a dry croak. No answer. I checked the bathroom empty, the closet empty. I ran back to the landing, screaming her name now, a raw, desperate sound. Silence, answered Asterisk then. I heard it, a faint, muffled sound. It was coming from downstairs, from the basement. It was a cry. Elena's cry, Asterisk. I don't remember descending the stairs. I only remember the roaring in my ears and the glacial pace of my legs. I crossed the dining room, the kitchen, and stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the inky blackness. The door to my office at the bottom was ajar, and a faint, bluish light, the glow of my computer monitor bled from the crack. The crying came from in there. Asterisk, Alina, I whispered. Asterisk, I started down, my hand sliding along the cold wall for balance. Each step was a victory over the screaming instinct to run. I pushed the office door open. Asterisk, the room was exactly as I'd left it. My chair was on its side. The manuscript was on the screen, and on the floor, in the center of the room, lay my wife. She was in her nightgown. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, unblinking. Her mouth was moving, but the only sound coming out was a thin, reedy whimper. She was alive, but she was not there. Her skin was pale and cold to the touch when I knelt beside her. Asterisk, I gathered her in my arms, sobbing, asking her what happened. Who did this? She didn't respond. Her eyes just stared past me at the ceiling. Asterisk, I carried her up the stairs and out of that house. I drove to the hospital with her in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket, silent and shivering. The doctors said it was a severe catatonic episode, likely triggered by extreme psychological trauma. They asked her questions. She gave no answers. They asked me what happened. I told them about the sounds, the footsteps, the feeling of something passing me on the stairs. They exchanged glances that spoke of grief counseling and delayed shock. Asterisk, that was 6 months ago. Alina is home now, in a new apartment in the city. The lights are always on. She rarely speaks, and when she does, it's in a whisper. She spends most of her time sitting by the window, looking out at the street, at the people, at the life she used to live. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up and find her standing over the bed, looking down at me. Her eyes are clear then, but full of a sorrow so deep it takes my breath away. Asterisk, last night, I asked her again what she saw. I didn't think she would answer, but she did. She leaned close, her breath cold on my cheek, and whispered. She told me it wasn't after her. It was never after her. It was in the basement with me, watching me work for hours, standing just behind my shoulder. And when it finally moved, when I heard it go upstairs, it wasn't going to get her. It had already been with her. It was just going to fetch me. And as it passed me on the stairs, going down, it was showing me the way. Asterisk. I didn't sleep last night. I'm not sure I'll ever sleep again. Because now, every time I walk into a dark room, I feel that same displacement of air. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the core, that I am no longer alone. It's not in the old farmhouse anymore. It followed us home. The job came with a house. That was the only way they could afford anyone, the realtor explained. A caretaker's cottage on the edge of the Ashford estate. 40 acres of woods and a manor house that had been empty for a decade. My job was simple. Walk the property line once a day. Note any fallen trees or signs of trespassers, and make sure the manor itself remained sealed. I'd been living in my car for 3 weeks. I said yes before she finished talking. The cottage was small but solid. A wood-burning stove, a bed that didn't sag, a sink with well water that ran brown for the first minute before clearing. The first few days were peaceful. I'd walk the eastern ridge in the morning, the western tree line in the afternoon. The manor loomed on the hill, a dark silhouette of Victorian gables and boarded windows. I never went inside. My instructions were clear. Check the locks. Report anything broken. On the 5th night, I woke to the sound of a door closing. Not a slam, but a firm, deliberate click, like someone pushing a heavy oak door into its frame. I lay still in the dark, listening to the blood rush in my ears. The cottage only had one door, the one I'd locked myself. I waited. The only sound was the wind in the eaves. After an hour, I convinced myself it was a dream. The next morning, I checked the manor's main entrance. The heavy padlock was still there, rusted and secure. But on the ground, in the dew-wet grass, was a single footprint. It was barefoot, the impression of 5 toes and a heel pressed deep into the mud, leading away from the door and toward the woods. It was too large to be mine. I told myself it was a hiker, a drifter. I reported it to the number I'd been given, got an automated voicemail, and left a message. No one called back. A week passed. The days were a routine of coffee and walking. The nights became difficult. I started sleeping with the lamp on. I'd hear things, not loud things, but small things. The creak of a floorboard in the kitchen when I was in the bedroom, the soft rustle of fabric from the empty closet. I'd get up, check, find nothing, and go back to bed. My mind was playing tricks. It had to be. Then I found the first note. It was tucked under the corner of my doormat. A scrap of yellowed paper, the kind from a legal pad. On it, written in smudged pencil, was a single word, get. I turned it over. Nothing. I scanned the tree line. The wind moved the branches, but nothing else. I crumpled the paper and burned it in the stove. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I walked the property line with a new awareness. The silence of the woods wasn't peaceful anymore. It was watchful. I found myself stopping every few minutes, just listening. That afternoon, I found the second note pinned to a tree on the western edge of my patrol. A straight pin driven through the paper and into the bark. This one had 2 words, get out. My hands shook as I pulled it free. I looked back toward the cottage. From this angle, I could see the roof, and beyond it, the black windows of the manor. I felt exposed. I ran back. I called the realtor. I got her voicemail. I called the emergency number on my contract. A tired-sounding man answered. I told him about the notes. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Just do your patrols, son. Ignore the rest." He hung up. That night, I barred the cottage door with a chair wedged under the handle. I put the lamp on the floor next to my cot. Its light, a small fortress against the dark. I must have fallen asleep because I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It was a wet, rhythmic sound. A dragging, slapping sound, like something heavy and damp being pulled across linoleum. It was coming from the kitchen. I didn't move. I stopped breathing. The sound continued, a slow circuit of the small room. I heard it bump into the leg of the table. I heard a long pause, and then the sound of a drawer opening. Silverware clinked softly. The drawer closed. The dragging, slapping sound started again, moving toward the bedroom door. The floorboard directly outside my door creaked. I stared at the gap between the door and the floor. The light from my lamp cast a thin orange line into the darkness of the hallway. I watched that line, and then something blocked it. A shadow, formless and absolute, passed slowly across the strip of light. It stopped in the middle. I could feel it on the other side of the wood. I could feel it listening. The knob turned. A soft, metallic click. I had locked it. The knob rattled once, gently, as if someone were testing it. Then, nothing. The shadow remained across the line of light. Minutes passed. An hour. I didn't move. My bladder burned. My eyes were dry from not blinking. The sun came up. The light under the door changed from orange to gray to gold. The shadow was gone. I don't know when it left. I lay there until I heard birds singing. Then I kicked the chair away and opened the door. The kitchen was empty. The drawer with the silverware was slightly open. On the table, arranged in a neat row, were 3 spoons, and next to them, a fresh, wet footprint on the dry linoleum. I didn't go on patrol that day. I packed my truck. I was throwing my bag into the cab when I stopped. Something was different. I looked toward the manor on the hill. The front door, the massive oak door with the rusted padlock, was standing open. It was just a dark rectangle in the stone facade, a mouth waiting. I got in the truck and drove. I didn't look back until I hit the main road. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods by my cottage. It was too far away to see details, just a pale shape against the green. It was watching me leave. I drove for 3 hours before I stopped. I got a motel room, showered, and tried to think. I called the realtor again. This time, she answered. I told her I quit, that someone was in the house, that they'd left notes. There was a long pause. Was the manor door open? She asked. I said yes. She sighed. A long, tired sound. They always leave when the manor door opens. They go back inside. For a while, I asked. Who are they? The previous caretaker, she said. He's been gone about 6 months. We were hoping he'd just moved on. He usually stays in the cottage, but when the manor door opens, he has to go back. They all do. I didn't ask who all were. I didn't want to know. I hung up. I threw my phone on the bed. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself I was free of it. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm in a new town now, a new state. I sleep with the lights on. I checked the locks constantly. Last night, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. I don't know why. I just opened my eyes and looked at the motel room door. There, in the gap between the door and the floor, the light from the parking lot was blocked by a shadow, a formless, absolute shadow, and the knob turned. A soft, metallic click. The door is locked. The last tenant had left in a hurry. That much was clear from the moment I unlocked the door to apartment 3B. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the faint, sweetish undertone of something forgotten in the refrigerator. But it was the wall that stopped me in the doorway. A single, dark brown handprint was smeared across the white paint, just above the light switch in the narrow hallway. Asterisk, I sighed, adding paint to the growing list of supplies I'd need. The landlord, a harried man named Mr. Henderson, who smelled of cheap cigars, had warned me the place was being rented as is. The price was too low for the neighborhood, a fact that should have made me suspicious. But desperation has a way of silencing common sense. My divorce had been finalized a month prior, and this cramped one-bedroom was the only thing I could afford on my own. Asterisk, the first week was spent scrubbing, painting, and assembling flat-pack furniture. The handprint washed off easily enough, a sickly brown stain that swirled down the sink drain. I painted the entire hallway a calming shade of light gray, a fresh start. At night, the city hummed its usual lullaby of distant sirens and traffic, and I slept soundly, exhausted by the manual labor. Asterisk, it started small. The toilet paper roll in the bathroom would unspool onto the floor. A long white tongue I'd step on with bare, cold feet in the morning. I chalked it up to a draft or the cheap, flimsy holder. Then the kitchen cabinets. I'd come home from work to find one or two of them slightly ajar, a dim, dark rectangle where I knew I'd left them flush and closed. Asterisk, I began to notice a pattern. The disturbances were always in my periphery. A flicker of movement at the end of the hall when I was in the living room. The sense of a shape just behind me when I washed my face at the bathroom mirror. A feeling that would vanish the instant I looked up. My reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and dripping. I told myself it was the adjustment, the stress of the new job, the lingering ghost of my old life. It was a convenient lie. Asterisk, one Tuesday, I had to stay late at the office to finish a project. It was past 11 when I finally trudged up the 3 flights of stairs. As I put my key in the lock, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping from inside my apartment. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump. It was the sound of a fist hitting a wall. My heart seized. Someone was in there. Asterisk, I stood frozen, key in hand, my breath catching in my throat. The thumping continued, steady and unhurried. I should have called the police. I should have gone back downstairs. Instead, a bolt of irrational anger shot through me. This was my place, my fresh start. I shoved the key in, turned the lock, and pushed the door open, ready to yell. Asterisk, the hallway was dark. The living room beyond was dark. The thumping had stopped. I fumbled for the light switch, my hand pressing the spot where the brown handprint had been. The single bulb in the hall fixture flickered on, illuminating nothing but my own coat on the hook and my shoes on the mat. I checked every room, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The bedroom, the bathroom, the tiny closet, empty. Asterisk. I stood in the middle of the living room, trying to slow my breathing. It was the old pipes, I decided, or a neighbor. The walls in this building were pink. I laughed, a short, nervous sound that died in the silence. I was on edge, that was all. I made myself a cup of tea and went to bed. Leaving the hall light on, asterisk, I was just drifting off, that hazy state between waking and sleeping, when I felt it. A pressure at the foot of the bed, not the weight of a cat or a person sitting down. It was a deeper, denser cold, as if a patch of the air itself had grown heavy and solid. It pressed down on the duvet, creating a shallow depression. My eyes flew open. The room was dark, but the hall light cast a pale sliver under the bedroom door. I stared at that sliver of light. I didn't dare look down at the foot of the bed. Asterisk. Then the thumping started again. This time it was right there, on the wall directly behind my headboard. Thump, thump, slow, deliberate, and deafeningly loud in the silence. I scrambled out of bed, my legs tangling in the sheets, and stumbled into the hall. The sound stopped the instant I was on my feet. I stood there, panting, staring at the blank gray wall where the handprint used to be. Asterisk. Over the next few days, I became a student of my own terror. I learned its habits. The thumping would start only when I was in bed, always from the wall behind my head. The cabinets would open during the quiet hours of the afternoon, the toilet paper unspooled at night. I tried to reason with it, to prove it was nothing. I placed a camera on a tripod in the living room, pointing at the kitchen. The footage showed nothing. The cabinet doors remained closed. Then, in a single, flickering frame, they were open. There was no movement, no shadow. They simply were open. Asterisk. The cold spot grew bolder. It wasn't just at the foot of the bed anymore. I'd feel it brush past me in the hallway, a sudden biting chill that raised goosebumps on my arms. Once, I was sitting on the sofa, reading, and the air beside me on the cushion compressed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the page, the words blurring into meaningless shapes, until the pressure lifted what felt like an hour later. Asterisk. The worst part was the silence that followed. It wasn't the normal quiet of an empty apartment. It was a listening silence, a waiting silence. I felt watched constantly by something that was patient and had all the time in the world. My sleep became fractured. I'd jolt awake at 3 a.m., my heart already racing, convinced I had heard my name whispered, but with no memory of the sound itself. Asterisk. I tried to ignore it, to live my life. I went to work. I smiled at colleagues. I answered emails. But I was a shell going through the motions. Home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison. The fear was a low-voltage current running through me at all times. Asterisk. It was a Saturday night. About 3 weeks after I'd moved in, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, trying to muster the courage to turn off the light. The cold presence was already there, a heavy weight in the corner of the room by the closet. I could almost see it now, a subtle distortion in the darkness, a place where the shadows seemed thicker, more substantial. It wasn't moving, it was just waiting. Asterisk. Then, the closet door began to slide open, slowly, the old wooden door grinding against its track with a low, mournful creak. I stared, transfixed, as the dark interior of the closet was revealed. Inside hung my shirts and jackets, limp and lifeless. My gaze was dragged from the closet to the wall beside it, the wall that faced my bed. Asterisk, and I saw it. The handprint asterisk, but it wasn't just one. Dozens of them were now slowly appearing on the gray paint, blooming from the plaster like dark, terrible flowers. Handprints of all sizes, smeared and pressed into the wall, appearing one after another in a silent, frantic rhythm. Palm fingers. It looked as if someone was being pushed through the wall from the other side, their hands bracing against the surface, trying to find purchase, trying to get out. Asterisk, the cold in the corner intensified, pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of dust and old pennies. The handprints kept appearing, climbing up the wall, spreading towards the ceiling. I couldn't move. I was pinned to the bed by a terror so complete it felt like a physical force. Asterisk, and then the wall began to bulge. Asterisk, right in the center of the frantic handprints. The plaster started to push outward, as if something huge and soft was pressing against it from within. It stretched, the paint cracking in a spiderweb pattern around the growing protrusion. It wasn't a fist or a head. It was a formless, yielding mass, the size of a torso, straining against its plaster prison. I heard a sound, a low, grinding groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the building. Asterisk, that was the moment my paralysis broke. I didn't think, I just moved. I shot off the bed, grabbing my keys from the dresser, and bolted for the front door. I didn't look back. I tore it open and slammed it shut behind me, running down the 3 flights of stairs, so fast I nearly fell twice. I burst out onto the quiet street, the cool night air a shock to my lungs. Asterisk, I stood on the sidewalk, shaking uncontrollably, staring up at the dark windows of my 3rd-floor apartment. The lights were still on in the bedroom. I could see the rectangle of the window, but I couldn't make out the wall. I didn't want to. Asterisk, I didn't go back inside. I slept in my car that night, and the next, I called Mr. Henderson on Monday and told him I was breaking the lease. He sputtered and threatened, but I didn't care. I forfeited my deposit, left all my furniture, and never set foot in that building again. Asterisk, I live in a new place now, on the other side of the city. It's bright and modern. The walls are thick. I sleep with the light on, a small concession. But sometimes, late at night, in the dead silence, I find myself staring at a wall. I wait for the slightest bulge, the faintest outline of a handprint, and I listen. I listen for the thumping, because a part of me knows that whatever was pushing its way through the plaster in apartment 3B isn't finished. It was patient then, and it will be patient now. And it learned that walls aren't really a barrier. They're just a delay.